Working for wages, integrated and competitive employment for people with developmental disabilities is revolutionary and controversial. It's also very successful. Employment opportunities for people with disabilities. It's a key issue in the 90s. Employment equity is being debated vigorously by legislators, business, and disabled consumers. Change is in the air, but if you're unemployed and disabled, progress can seem painfully slow. Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Last month, the Western Employment Network Conference was held in Edmonton, Alberta. DNET was there, and today we present a special program from that conference. The Western Employment Network is a coalition of organizations from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. Its aim is to increase the participation of persons with disabilities in the workforce. The network was formed to provide the exchange of information and ideas about employment, particularly in the area of supported employment. This year's conference, now in its third year, was held during the last week of October. It was called New Workers, New Workplaces, with a mission to help forge new partnerships in philosophy and enterprise between the disabled community, service providers, and business.
C9 is a new look.
Oh, it's the Alberta
Career and Development.
And change involves risks.
The message was clear, and it was delivered during the opening address by Norm A. Weiss, Alberta Minister of Career Development and Employment.
Our traditional labor pool is shrinking, and many employers will have to recognize that large, cleverly written ads in the newspapers aren't all that is involved in finding the best people for the job. They are ignoring, in my views, many potential and talented employees, people who will give that extra mile with dedication and commitment, with pride.
During the 3 days of the conference, delegates were exposed to many new ideas in the field of employment practices and given a chance to share a vision of how the future might work.
For him to have to get up and be to work at 8 o'clock in the morning would never work for him.
Training on the job. Supported employment, where the work site replaces vocational programs for the developmentally disabled, was the agreed job training of the future. And some were talking of a program where the trainers, rather than working with the workers, would go into the work sites and prepare the employer to create the training. Yet, there was also agreement that much job training today did not meet major needs in the community.
This 80% unemployment rate for people with disabilities I see as a national disgrace.
As Roger Van Lieshout of the Manitoba Employment Development Corporation explained, many current employment practices skim the cream of the crop.
With a lot of good programs around the country, we've been in a situation where we've been doing a lot of creaming. That is selecting people who may in fact have a label but not necessarily a disability. And as a result, we've been neglecting a lot of individuals with more severe disabilities who in fact may have the potential to work, but in fact haven't had the ability to be able to develop the skills and experiences that they need in order to be able to represent themselves to employers as good candidates for jobs.
I'm not there for free labor. I'm there to work and I'm there to get paid.
The ongoing dialogue, which took place on the floor and in workshops between self-advocates, business and service providers, made it abundantly clear that disabled persons like Ken Nelson were not about to allow themselves to be overlooked on employment issues.
How do you go up to an employer, try to be honest and say, you've got grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, today he's going to laugh at you and he's going to say, that's not good enough. You require grade 12 to work here. Where is the fairness? That's my whole point. Education today is something that employers look for. People like me and so many others across the country, we don't have that. We have to depend on people to go find work. And if, in a lot of cases, if you don't have the supports there, the work does not get there. Because they use that educational crutch.
Coming up next on DNET, is there a future for sheltered workshops? hot topic at the Western Employment Network Conference was the future of sheltered workshops, sometimes called vocational programs. Many people at the conference felt that they don't give people with developmental disabilities real jobs. Sheltered workshops have their start in activities programs that were designed as part of the care of persons with mental disabilities. Eventually, training programs were developed which shared some characteristics of work and theoretically meant that individuals could move on to employment. But very few people did make that jump to employment. Accepting those limitations, sheltered workshops and vocational centers developed programs which offered training in a simulated employment setting. The development of this model led to very fuzzy boundaries between the training and any eventual transition to employment. Roger Van Lieshout, who represents the Manitoba Employment Development Corporation, says that in most cases those employment opportunities did not materialize.
Unfortunately, what we found in our experience with sheltered workshops is that a lot of people with disabilities who enter that particular system spend an incredible length of time getting ready for jobs that never seem to quite happen. In that, a study that was done recently in the United States had indicated that people with disabilities, when they enter a sheltered workshop, will in turn experience about 19.7 years of pre-vocational training. And that's a heck of a lot of time, I guess you could say, in terms of getting ready for jobs.
Today, sheltered workshops and vocational programs are in transition. Growing support for independent living has fostered a shift towards providing training on the job in a real job, a chance for the developmentally disabled to participate in the mainstream instead of training for job readiness. Workers are trained on the job in skills they will need to do the job. Yet while the movement towards integration in competitive employment has shifted the emphasis to the job site, workshops still have a role to play.
There's really a push from organizations that say
Cheryl Crocker, who's with the Rehabilitation Practitioners Program at Grant MacEwan Community College in Edmonton, feels that it may not be realistic to expect all individuals to make the transition out of workshops.
We have a large number of people who are getting older. They're 50, 55 years old. Those individuals have come up through a history of segregated services. Those individuals have not been the kind of people who have been typically looked at to make the first move into supported employment. And I guess on one hand, I think we need to be looking at that with those individuals. On the other hand, if you've been in a setting for 20 years, if you're 50 or 55 years old, I don't know how feasible it is for us to push those individuals into looking at competitive employment.
The debate over how to integrate individuals who have a long history of institutionalization is an important reminder that basic competitive employment may not be appropriate for those persons with severe disabilities. To meet these special needs, alternative and flexible options need to be developed so that more severely disabled persons can gain a measure of control over their own lives. But for a large number of individuals, sheltered workshops no longer provide the answer.
I think we're dealing with a group of people that have been oppressed.
Clint Hames, who represents the Chilliwack Employment Project, says that self-advocates have an important role to play in getting that message out.
Maybe a visionary way to look at that would be to say the people that have gotten out, the people that now are truly self-advocating, and the people that are now consuming the services, the employment services, have a role to play in going back, I think, to the workshops, to the sheltered workshops, and talking with their peers and their friends and with the families of those people and saying, let's find a way to get you organized so that the pressure that's coming on closing workshops is coming from the people who are in the workshops and are doing the work in the workshops, not from the staff, not from the government, but I think the only way the movement will gain any real momentum is having those consumers speaking for themselves.
Armand Routier lives and works in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island. At the conference, he delivered the same message about sheltered workshops. How did you feel the day that you left the sheltered workshop?
I was really happy when I left the workshop. I finally got to be free of sitting there doing the same thing day after day, week after week. It was time for me to leave the workshop. It was not a place for me
and I wanted to be out where I could be with the ordinary so-called people of Port Alberni.
The key to getting people with developmental disabilities into the real world is a real job. When we come back, I'll look at supported employment. Supported employment places people with disabilities in jobs, assists with training, and provides ongoing support as it's needed. Dennis Miller and Paul Clark are two employers who have hired workers under supported employment programs. Both were at the conference talking about how the program has worked out. Michael Foss works here at the Alberta Ministry of Family and Social Services. It's a job he has held for 4 years, and it's a job he does well. Michael Foss is a good example of successful supported employment. His first contact with the ministry was as part of a job experience program arranged by his school. That first step was initiated in part to evaluate his ability to make a transition to outside employment and also to provide him with an opportunity to acquire new job skills.
Thank you. I'll just sign this.
Once he was adjusted to the new environment, Michael was introduced to the building and the people he would work with as part of his job as a courier. Integral to the whole project is the idea that any work performed must be meaningful, and in Michael's case, courier work was seen as an ideal vehicle for his energetic enthusiasm.
Bye, Michael.
Mike has been around. He is productive. He is productive.
Paul Clark is the manager of the department where Michael works. He was responsible for establishing the accommodation needed on the job. An important part of that was evaluating the progress made by Michael to establish the level of support that would be required.
We developed little systems whereby we drew a picture of the building on the wall and we put symbols up there beside the particular floor, and that symbol matched to something on that box, and he knew that that symbol and that symbol were the same. Maybe didn't know it was a number 7 or a number 8, but the symbols matched, and that was the key. And anyway, we kept pushing him. We would find a job, give it to him, and let him run with it. And once he got it down pat, then we'd get another one. And we kept pushing and pushing and pushing until we found his limits. And as soon as we found his limits, then we knew where we were at. We found his ability to communicate. When Mike first came aboard, he was very shy individual. Wouldn't say anything to anybody. Now, he'll communicate with anybody. He'll talk to the deputy minister. He talks to anybody that walks down the corridor. He's been around. He's well respected within the organization. And Mike's there. Mike's a part of our branch.
Can you remember what your job was like when you first started?
Oh, I like it. I do. I do like my job.
Do you like it more now than you did before?
Yeah.
How come? What's different?
Oh, I like it. It's not boring. I like it.
Today, Michael works independently, primarily as a courier. To be successful in that role involved the participation of a job coach who at the beginning was there full-time to provide Michael with support. As the weeks went by, the job coach dropped out of the picture, leaving Michael to assume an increasingly independent role. In supported work programs, the job coach is the key link, easing the transition between the needs of the individual worker and the requirements of the employer. Paul Clark.
We work in an environment which is not being associated with the physically or mentally disabled. So we don't know all the nuances. We don't know all the ways of dealing with emotional problems, etc. So the commitment was that we would get into this program providing we had a job coach. And the job coach proves to be invaluable, assisting us into getting instruction to the student on how to do the job, looking for setting some standards, communicating communicating was the big thing, because we wouldn't communicate with Michael like we would have communicated, we'll say, with a non-handicapped staff.
Is that everything?
Yeah, that's it.
Dennis Miller runs a small wine store in Edmonton. Miller and his staff have built a thriving business by paying attention to business basics, friendly service, and meeting the needs of customers. Miller has also been very successful in hiring a developmentally disabled worker as part of a supported employment program.
Let's see how you're putting these stickers on. You putting them on nice and straight? Yep. Okay. When you finish doing these boxes here, I want you to check on this shelf and make sure everything's priced properly too. Okay? Okay, thanks. Must admit, initially I thought I really don't have time for this, especially if it involves in-depth explaining what to do and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, I figured, to be real honest with you, I thought life's tough enough. Let's give him a chance and see what we can do. It was basically a trial period for about 3 weeks, and I wanted to meet him and just see if it was going to be a babysitting situation or if he could do a lot of things. I must admit, Gifford, I've never had a problem with him. He's been really receptive to whatever we tell him to do. We have to praise him a lot, of course, and give him lots of positive reinforcement. But for the most part, he's been a real asset to the business. He's here on time, which is certainly major in my books. Punctuality is a big thing in any job. And Gifford does what he's told. He adds lots of comic relief through the days, and just a nice person to work with. He's got a good disposition.
As a small businessman, Miller understands that initiatives to hire workers, disabled or not, must make good sense as a realistic business decision.
He couldn't do it on his own merits, and if I couldn't take him on his own merits, I didn't want to have him. It started off, I would say, to a slight degree, a little bit of simply, let's give him a shot. And more I realized it had to be a business decision, but he made it real easy to make it a business decision, and that's why he's here.
When we come back, the problems people with psychiatric disabilities face getting a job. Getting a job in this economic climate is tough enough. As this workshop demonstrates, getting and holding down a job has never been easy for people with psychiatric disabilities. Deborah Chenery is a program director for the Canadian Mental Health Association in Lethbridge, Alberta. As part of the Western Employment Network conference, she led this workshop dealing with the problems which people with psychiatric disabilities face in the workplace.
One of the key things about working is, and the reason that it is such a rehabilitative program, is that it provides individuals with the ability to feel like they belong to something, that they can make their own decisions, that they're part of something, that they're contributing and they're being rewarded for something. And that's why we do find that despite all of these other barriers, that people do still want to work.
This is lunchtime at Progress Place, a clubhouse model drop-in center for psychiatrically disabled people in Toronto. Its purpose is to help individuals improve their lives. Working in this on-site cafe is part of that. A chance to be productive and busy working as part of a team. It's also a place where they can use those skills to good advantage in transitional work programs. But transitional employment programs and work experience often are not enough for the psychiatrically disabled person to obtain and hold down a job. They often face problems in adjusting and adapting to a work environment.
One of the biggest problems that they deal with is an incomplete work history. And as everyone knows, whether you're dealing with a disability or you're not, if you go in to apply for a job and you've got 4 or 5 years where you haven't done anything, first thing the employer is going to ask you is, where have you been for the last 3 or 4 years? I've been in a hospital. Good, we'll see you. That's about the reaction that they get. So the incomplete work history is really, really an issue with them. Limited education, again, is another one, and a lot of this is dealing with the interruptions in the education that they have, because often the onset of their illness starts about 18 to 25 years of age. They may have been in school, but some of the symptoms may starting to come out, so they may have dropped out for a while. They may have admissions to hospital.
One of the solutions to an incomplete work history can be providing an opportunity to add to a resume by doing volunteer work, such as the work in this cafe at Progress Place.
What do you think of our new recipe?
Chenery says that in order for students to succeed in school, the education system must become more flexible. It must create programs where students can function at a pace that doesn't place a heavy workload and a lot of stress on individuals. And the system must also recognize that the same kind of pressure exists in job training programs as well.
Often someone with a psychiatric disability can't handle that structure, the 40 hours. Perhaps they can do the 40 hours, but they can't do it in an 8 to 5 kind of situation. You know, we're dealing with side effects of medications, and there's so many other things that come into play with that.
Getting a job doesn't end the problems. Often workers are faced with difficulties and challenges in fitting in. Jay Wax now works part-time for an insurance company, but his past experiences with work were difficult and unsuccessful.
Previously, when I had jobs, it was very bad for me. It was a lot of suffering. I'm not blaming anybody, but it was very tough for me. I didn't fit in. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Also, I had my own personal problems.
We often forget that once the people are in the employment situation, that they're faced with situations where they get a paycheck and they don't know what to do with it. The life skill training has stopped at that level, at the point of entry of employment, and they don't know how to socialize with so-called normal people. They spend a lot of their time in institutions with other patients in hospitals, and they're in the workforce and they're meeting a whole new group of people, and nobody has taught them how to socialize with these people, how to respond to questions, how to sit around a coffee table and actually just converse with people.
But if you guys come in once a month and 2 months didn't show up, you know.
Everyone is affected by stress levels in the workforce. For the psychiatrically disabled person who already faces high fatigue levels, learning to cope can be very important.
They're dealing constantly with the effects of the medications. There is so many side effects that come into play. A lot of times the side effects have a physical disability in that it can make them ill. Most jobs nowadays have a very high level of stress, and it's not so much that we want to protect these people and alienate them from all the rest of the people and say, well, we don't want them to deal with stress, because it's going to happen. But we need to address how we can teach them the coping skills of how to deal with the stress. What kind of things can they do on the job sites to walk away for a little while, rethink, regather themselves.
Chenery says that these issues are important accommodations in getting persons with psychiatric disabilities back into the workplace. They already face a great stigma in society. Combining that with low education and few job skills and expecting these individuals to succeed in the job marketplace is creating a situation that is ripe for failure.
We're seeing deinstitutionalization of people, of psychiatric patients from hospitals, from care centers, and the demand is going to be more and more on the community to help these people integrate. We don't want them out walking the streets. They don't want to be out walking the streets. They want to be a viable part of the community, and as such we need to respond to those needs. We need to look at those employment opportunities to offer them the opportunity to make a real life out in the community.
And that's our show from the Western Employment Network Conference in Edmonton.
Next year's conference will be held in Saskatchewan. Joe, what was the strongest impression you came away with from the conference?
Having attended a lot of conferences over the last 10 years, Susan, what I was impressed with was the number of disabled consumers in attendance. They also had plenty of opportunity to speak their own mind, and they did. How about you?
Well, I agree with you, and I also was very impressed to see the networking behind these consumers. It's really a big growing force out there.
I'm Joe Coughlin. Happy holidays.
And I'm Susan Pettit. From all of us at DNET, season's greetings.
If you'd like to comment on this week's show, our address is the Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6.